So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged. We're going to be doing another tier list today, and we've gone through one faction of elves, one faction of men, so it makes sense now that we're going to move on to a faction of dwarves. And we're going to start with Khazad-dûm, because Erebor in the last patch didn't really get too much in the way of changes, to be honest with you, whereas Khazad-dûm had a couple of rather significant ones, which will change things up quite significantly. So I'm kind of the opinion at this point in time in Reforged that in terms of pure infantry strength, I think Khazad-dûm are probably the strongest in the game. Now that's not taking into account other factors like supporting cavalry and supporting ranged units, of course, because that has a massive bearing on how successful you're actually going to be on the field. And obviously with Khazad-dûm you are fairly static in what you're able to do. You're a fairly slow moving faction. But once you get into melee, when it comes to pure martial might and all-round performance, especially when it comes to defensive stats like armour, I do think Khazad-dûm are going to be stronger than everyone else. Other factions like Imladris and Numenor who sort of inhabit that space as well. You know, with Imladris obviously you can bring in your cavalry to support, and with Numenor you have stuff like your armour-piercing ranged corps. But for Khazad-dûm it's a little bit more one note with their infantry. They do have some good supporting units, but they are generally quite expensive as well, and you can't bring them in the same kind of numbers. But we'll get onto those as we go through the roster itself. And honestly, I kind of think Khazad-dûm are going to be on the higher end of the spectrum here, because having a cursory glance through their roster, there aren't many units that I would think poorly of in the roster, to be honest with you. And there aren't, yeah, I mean, there's quite a few actually that would be on the higher end as well, so I'm expecting probably more S tier units here than I had for Imladris, who I think going back to Imladris I would put the Imladris Guardians into S tier as well, or Gondor, so considering both of those factors, those two would both have 2. I think Khazad-dûm are going to have at least 1 or maybe even 2 more, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. I think we'll start off with their entry level unit, which is the Dwarven Miners, which is actually a unit which I don't think all that highly of, mainly because yes, they're the cheapest unit in the Dwarven roster, but for a militia unit they're honestly not that cheap, and you don't have to spend that much more money before you get into sort of the standard basic units that you get for the dwarves. Obviously it is a little bit more expensive to jump into the lower end for the dwarves, much like it is for the elves than, for example, the kingdoms of men or orcs. But I do think it's worth punting the extra gold up to go into those units over the miners, and part of the reason for this is the miners are one of 2 clear examples in the Dwarven roster that are quite poor under ranged fire. Their armour is not really there, and they don't have a shield value at all. They are pretty much the only example of what is effectively a militia tier armour piercing unit, but the dwarves have got plenty of armour piercing in their roster anyway, and for the cost I'm not really seeing too much of a value proposition here. Even if you have a little bit of money left over at the end, I think it's more worthwhile, more often than not, to spend that on upgrading the armour of stuff like your Legion units later on, because there you'll get a little bit more legs on those units, a little bit tougher all around, more so than the miners. I'm honestly going to put them into D. I mean, I do know that if you do have a little bit of money left over, then having a unit of miners is a no-brainer, but in much the same way as the civilians for Gondor, while they do have a place, for me, I would always be far more tempted to go for upgrading the higher quality units that you have, or just reworking the whole composition so you have sort of more quality on average, more so than the miners. That might be a little harsh for the miners, but I do think that the rest of Khazad-dûm's roster will more than make up for that. Speaking of which, we have the Warriors of Khazad-dûm, the entry-level line infantry unit that Khazad-dûm have available to them, and obviously heavy infantry is very much what the dwarves are going to be heavily focused on, and even here at the lower end, relatively cheap, slightly more expensive than the basic units of line infantry from the kingdoms of men, more in line with what you would expect from the elves. However, they also have that extra armour, which I honestly think, based on the cost, based on the things you can do, I don't know whether I'd put them into B or A. I think it's got to be A. I mean, just for the value that they can deliver, in much the same way as many of the elven units can. Fighting them one-on-one is very, very difficult, and well, to do if you're like an orc or a kingdom of men, of course, so you have to try and swarm them. But this is one of the best units the dwarves can use to try and prevent swarming, because they have more men in the unit, they're slightly cheaper, so you can field a few more of them. A is maybe a little generous, but I feel as though, because I was quite harsh on the miners, I think that kind of balances itself out. You could make the argument here for B, I think, but just based on the fact that in class for the price, they'll generally come out on top against most other units. And in comparison to something like the Swords of Rivendell, for example, the extra solidity of the Dwarven armour and the shields, obviously, gives them a bit of a better presence all around, I think. Although, having said that, it's a real interesting one. This is actually probably the most difficult choice in the whole roster, to be honest with you, because having looked through the rest of them, I've kind of made up my mind about what the rest of them are going to be. The Warriors of Khazad-dûm, though, are kind of a different matter. I am actually going to drop them down to B, actually, looking at this, because there is another unit that we'll get to very soon that I think maybe deserves the A tier spot, because it's actually worth paying a little bit extra for them, I think, most of the time. Then we have the Mercenary Guildsmen. So the Mercenary Guildsmen are an interesting unit because they're shared between themselves and a couple of other factions as well, Cardland most notably. This is a unit that I'm not all that crazy about, to be honest with you. Mainly because, much in the same way that I was just talking about with the Warriors of Khazad-dûm, there are other options for line infantry, many other options for line infantry that the dwarves have. All of them are pretty much more expensive than the Mercenary Guildsmen, but all of them are going to perform better over the long haul in a battle. The extra few men that you get over the Warriors of Khazad-dûm isn't really worthwhile either. Lower morale. Khazad-dûm's morale in general is pretty damn good, and the mercenaries do kind of let the side down in that regard. The mounted variants are, of course, the only cavalry that Khazad-dûm have available to them, so we'll get to them a little bit later on. The only thing they do have in their favour is that they are armour piercing at the very least with maces. The little icon there shows a sword, but they do wield maces in combat, which does give them a little bit of extra utility. But even with that, Khazad-dûm are not hurting for armour piercing elsewhere in their roster. And to be honest with you, I was going to put them into C, but I really don't see when you would bring the Mercenary Guildsmen. I think the fact that they're armour piercing and the fact that they're reasonably cheap, maybe sometimes you could justify it, but not that often. So I'm actually going to put them into D here. They will rank more highly for Cardland. In, again, similar situation with the civilians from Gondor being more highly rated in certain other factions. I think that will be the case with the mercenaries as well in Cardland, certainly, because Cardland maybe on the front line don't have the same level of AP that the dwarves have available to them. But I really can't justify bringing the Mercenary Guildsmen in most situations against a lot of other factions. Then we'll skip over the Legion units for now, because we'll get on to the Sentries of Khazad-dûm, which are on the same tier as the Warriors of Khazad-dûm. Another interesting unit, this. I think this is a unit that I am actually going to put into A tier, because Khazad-dûm, with a unified phalanx, if you're going for a really defensive build, they are definitely a worthwhile pick, mainly because the other unit of pikes they have, while certainly better, are very expensive. So if you do want to sort of blanket the line with pikes and put them into phalanx formation, it is necessary to bring the sentries. And as a dwarven pike unit, obviously their armour is decent, their abilities in combat are also very good, and I do feel as though A is, because of the cost efficiency that they offer, I feel as though that is fair. And Khazad-dûm are also able to cover for their lack of a shield much more easily than several other factions can, because of course most of their other units are going to be heavily armoured and shielded, and you can get them in front of the pikes, and it makes Khazad-dûm very tough to break down from the front when you do that. Obviously bringing more pikes will take away from some of the more damaging units you have, but it's all about what fits for the situation, what build you're going for. Speaking of which, we shall now move on to the Legion units, and we'll go through by numbers, I think, starting off with the second Legion, because of course the first, well, no, we'll go numbers. We'll start off with the first Legion, even though the first Legion are probably a tier above the other Legion units. I guess we'll go by numbers. So the first Legion pikes, in the last patch they were pretty much on a par with the Imladris pikemen, so that would have put them at A tier, of course. Overall, they used to deal a little bit less damage than the Imladris pikes, but they had a shield value and thicker armour, so it kind of balanced itself out. They were very similar units in what strengths they offered to the factions, but now, very different kind of unit, because now they have gained armour piercing, which makes them, on average, probably the most damaging unit of pikes in the game. And also, they've had a cost increase to reflect that. So they're obviously going to be very, very strong on the front line with armour piercing, especially against certain factions. Armour piercing is going to be maybe a little bit more of a waste against factions like Linden or Harad, but the vast majority of the time that armour piercing is going to give them a real edge, a real bite on the front line. And considering the main downside of pikes is the fact they do take quite a long time to do their killing, this is a big step up in my opinion. Even for the cost, which now they cost about the same as a unit of Lance Knights, which, considering the kind of havoc they can wreak on the front line, that is something to consider. I mean, I think armor-piercing pikes of this tier, I mean, we've seen armor-piercing pikes in the past with the Southron pikemen, but their stats are so low that the armor-piercing doesn't really make up for the fact, well, it does kind of, it makes them an average pike unit, but their stats are terrible, and also they're very easy to kill with archers because of their light armor. I think you have to put them into S, just because when it comes to pikes, this and another unit of pikes, which we'll get onto at a later date, are the two which really do stand out. You know, and this one is because of the attack that they can lay down, as well as being very solid with that dwarven armor and shield. So that is, for me, it's got to be an S tier unit just because of that. Like, if you're in a narrow choke point against Khazad-dûm and the First Legion are at the centre of it, if you don't have any ranged tools or a massive amount of mass to push through them, you're in real trouble because of the damage they can put out. However, next we have the Second Legion Axe Guard. So they are, of course, the shock infantry. You can upgrade the armour. Dwarven shock infantry in general is obviously going to be pretty hefty when it comes to the stats that they have. Decently expensive, though. The problem that the Second Legion have is the presence of another unit in the roster, honestly, because obviously as a unit they are pretty decent. However, in much the same way as the Mercenary guildsmen, there is another unit in the roster that I would be bringing over the Second Legion 9 times out of 10. The Hammers of Gundabad, of course, which we'll get onto later. The only real advantage the Second Legion have is the fact that you can upgrade the armour and that they have a slight shield value. But as we'll get onto later, for me, the Hammers of Gundabad really are the superior choice. If you want to go for a massive amount of shock infantry, you can of course bring both. But for me, just because of that, I would put them into B. Now, they are still a very strong unit, which you could definitely justify bringing. But personally, I do prefer the Hammers of Gundabad, and they will be slightly higher than the Second Legion. And that's the reason why, as a unit, I would be tempted to put them into A, I think. But again, it's all about the options you have available to you in the faction for the money. And I think the Second Legion do lag behind their fellow dwarves in that respect. Then we come to the Third Legion. Now, the Third Legion, of course, are the upper end, sort of the upper mid-tier unit of line infantry that Khazad-dûm have available to them. They can upgrade their armour. So when you're talking about units like this, you're talking about the slightly more expensive stuff like Alcarondas Legion, Numenorian Cohorts, Arable Legionaries, even stuff like Imladris Guardians. This is the sort of company that the Third Legion keeps. And most units like this, unless they tend to underperform a little bit, go into A tier, generally speaking. Especially for a quality-focused faction like Khazad-dûm, because you do need to lean into these higher quality units if you're going to have the impact on a battle that you want. Because it's rare as Khazad-dûm that you're going to have a numbers advantage over your opponent. Maybe if you're fighting off against one of the elves, you will. Or maybe if one of the Kingdoms of Men have gone really heavy into their quality, you can maybe get a numbers advantage. But generally speaking, as Khazad-dûm, you're going to have less men on the field than your opponent. So it follows you're going to need higher quality. And on the front line, Third Legion, fully upgraded, alongside pikes of varying descriptions, armor-piercing shock infantry of varying descriptions. You can't really go too far wrong with them. And the Third Legion have always been a stalwart performer. Couldn't put them into S. Honestly, if I was going to put them into another tier, I'd probably drop them down to B, if anything. But for me, you have to put the Third Legion into A, I think, because I've never really seen them perform poorly. The only time I've seen them struggle would, of course, be against heavy AP, but the dwarves have got other options that they can use to try and counteract that. Now, we move on to a unit which in the past would have been S tier. We have the 4th Legion Shield Guard. 4th Legion, of course, used to not be subject to the spear malus that most other units have, so that essentially made them line infantry with an anti-cavalry bonus that attacks faster, because spears do attack faster than standard line infantry, and of course that made them monstrously efficient on the front line. I'm glad that that has changed, and they are now sort of filling their role as upper mid-tier spears. Now, though, of course, it does mean that they have to perform the role of basically support, maybe getting into shield wall in sort of a choke point or on the front line to help counteract a mass push, or sort of guarding the back ranks and zoning out enemy cavalry, which is an important role for Khazad-dûm. Because, of course, generally speaking, mobility is something that you're not going to have in your favour. And I think as a result of that, they're going to be as well. Because I think B is fairly good. Obviously on the front line they are going to be still fairly good against most basic units from other factions. Just through sheer quality they will win out. But obviously you are paying a lot more in that regard. And I think just generally speaking now I think B is about right for them. Because they do their job of zoning out cavalry and forming up formations and being that sponge very, very well. But they are not the infantry killing machines that they used to be in the past, which is a good thing because obviously it gives you a reason to actually bring stuff like the 3rd Legion now and the Warriors of Khazad-dûm, whereas in the past there really wasn't a reason to do that. Now we move on to the unit which I dropped the 2nd Legion into B tier for, the Hammers of Gundabad. Why are they better in my opinion? Well, first, 20 more men, which is fairly significant. 20 extra soldiers is getting into the region where it does make a tangible impact on the battle. They can also deploy stakes, which is a bit of throwaway utility really, but it's still nice. The main difference is the fact that they're locked morale. Locked morale is an incredibly useful tool in certain situations where if you're starting to be overrun, one of the main issues in a siege, for example, when you're trying to retreat to a better position, is the enemy can sort of follow you as all of your units start to retreat and then breaking starts to happen throughout the lines. Having a unit of locked morale infantry, however, allows you to basically stand in the way of this, and it doesn't matter how overwhelming the odds are, they will stand and fight to the bitter end. Which, regardless of what you're doing, obviously it also stops morale shocks from chain routing your whole front line. So I think for those reasons and the fact that in melee they perform relatively the same, to be honest with you, that's why I would put them into A tier, above the 2nd Legion. That locked morale is a very, very useful thing. Khazad-dûm's morale is pretty decent in general, but I do think that puts them over the edge. Now we move into the upper echelon, really. We'll start off with the Sons of the Fallen because they don't have multiple HP. Sons of the Fallen, very good spears, armor piercing. I believe they're still armor piercing anyway. You pay a lot for them, to be fair. It's one of those situations where they're kind of a similar price to the Elder Enway Spearmen. And honestly, much like the Elder Enway Spearmen, I would put them into A. Because I feel as though it's probably about where they should be. I wouldn't go as far as putting them into S tier. Yes, they can perform incredibly well because of their quality and their stats. But for the price, I would say that there are other units I would rather bring. There are other compositions I would rather mess around with if I was going to spend over 1,000 florins on a single unit. The Sons of the Fallen are still very strong and you will still see them a fair amount. But I think that again, it's more the case of there are other units that I would rate more highly than them, and I would be more likely to bring in a composition than the Sons of the Fallen, which is what holds them back from going even higher, because once again that AP makes them very, very dangerous. But yeah, I would put them into A, because they're not technically a bodyguard tier unit either, so they don't have the multiple HP that some of the others have. In much the same vein, I would actually put the Legion Bodyguard into A tier as well. Legion Bodyguard, one of the main things the Dwarven factions, both of them, can do is bring a ton of bodyguard tier infantry to the field. They can both bring at least 3 units of them. Obviously, I think Erebor can actually bring 4, but more on that at a later date. Legion Bodyguard, obviously really strong, better than a lot of other bodyguards of the same class. The thing that holds them back, once again, for Khazad-dûm, is the fact they have other options that are probably, I would rate a little more highly than them. And that's really the only reason. I mean, in melee, they're really, really good. They'll buff the morale of nearby troops, which is always going to be nice, of course. But that's really the only justification I can give for not putting them into S tier. The fact that there are other choices in that regard, but still very strong. Because now we move on to the double trouble that is the Guards of Khazad-dûm and the Mithril Guard, which I can say right now they're both going into S. The Guards of Khazad-dûm, first and foremost. The Guards of Khazad-dûm are effectively the same thing as the Legion Bodyguard, only they have armor piercing, which of course, again, is a big deal, because a lot of the factions in the game, at least to a certain extent, will rely on armour, and the Guards of Khazad-dûm will be able to crack right on through that. Obviously in the past it used to be the other way around, where the Mithril Guard were the armour piercing variant. That has swapped around now, which I think makes more sense, to be honest with you, because as we'll get onto in a moment, the Mithril Guard have 3 hit points because of the Mithril. Guards of Khazad-dûm here doing more damage with their armour piercing weaponry. And they're a real force of nature, especially when you put them alongside the other elites. If you run with all 3 of them, it puts a centre to your army, which, while very expensive, can be so difficult to bring down. And yeah, the thing that sets the Guards of Khazad-dûm apart from their brethren in that regard is the fact that they tend to do a little bit of extra damage. But the Meteor Guard, obviously with their 3 hit points, also have to go up here. It's very rare that you'll see a unit of regular infantry. I would say regular in inverted commas, but you know, units like Nazgul are obviously monstrous. Like, monstrous units can have like more than 2 hit points generally. But outside of that, there are only, I believe, 2 units in the game to have 3 hit points, and that is the Meteor Guard and the Pharazim Swordmasters from Numenor. And of course, with the shield and additional armour of the Meteor Guard, they're even tougher still. Incredibly tough to wear down. Very safe place to put your general, especially in a siege. And when it comes to, obviously, a war of attrition, the dwarves are obviously going to be pretty scary to behold on the field. Now we shall move into their supporting units. So you can see here immediately the infantry. There's a couple of duds, I think, in the Khazad-dûm roster, which I can barely see myself bringing. But all of the other choices, I think, are valid to varying degrees. There are some that I would obviously rate more highly than others based on this. But you can't really go too far wrong with Khazad-dûm's infantry, to be honest with you. As you would expect, considering the fact that that is so clearly the focus of their faction. That's not all they have going for them, however. Orc Hunters of Khazad-dûm. An interesting arch unit, this, because much like the Miners, they're kind of the other unit in the Khazad-dûm roster, or at least the other Dwarven unit in the Khazad-dûm roster, which is maybe a little bit more fragile. Their armour values are not particularly high. They're more like an Elven Archer, really, as I've said several times in the past. Like, they trade in a little bit of survivability for being maybe a little bit more damaging, both at melee and in range, actually, because they pull out 2 axes when it comes to getting to business up close and personal. I think it's an interesting trade-off, the damage for the survivability, because it means they can skirmish, but maybe not as efficiently as you would want. I think, based on the damage and based on the fact that, you know, other Elven Archers of this type will probably find themselves in B tier. I think for Khazad-dûm, because it's the only archer you have, and generally speaking you will have to bring them, I think B is probably fair for them. Obviously they're not a ranged, focused faction at all, but what units they do have available here are decent at the very least. And I think B tier is quite fair, actually, for the Orc Hunters. The one problem they will have is against really sort of low tier archers, they can find themselves overwhelmed, and also it's not going to be efficient to take that fight anyway. And against better archers, that's where the lighter armour will actually start to hurt them. But again, it's kind of a necessity in some cases to bring the Orc Hunters, so you'll see them a lot. But yeah, I think B is probably fair for them. Khazad Reclaimers. In the last patch, they were the sort of ranged unit that you would fear as Khazad-dûm. You still should, to be fair. Axe throwers don't do armour piercing damage, and from the front, shields can block their damage to a certain extent. However, if they do hit, their base damage is massive, so they can devastate pike lines and the like, whether you use them aggressively as part of a push, or whether you have them in a defensive stance in behind your own pike line. They're definitely something you need to watch out for. Also, in melee, they become nice two-handed shock infantry as well, in the same vein as something like the 2nd Legion or the Hammers of Gundabad, albeit not quite as specialised as those two units, so while they can do a job, they won't be as strong. But due to the sheer amount of damage that axe throwers can do, especially tankier ones like this, where it's difficult actually to try and counteract them, I think you have to put the Khazad Reclaimers into A. So, you know, another unit up in A tier for Khazad, but I think it's fair because they're very strong heavy infantry as well as being very damaging at range. A good unit of all-round axe throwers there. Now, this is a unit which is quite interesting, to be honest with you. We have the Iron Watch of Miramir. I've seen it in action myself in the current patch, and I'm not sure where to put it, to be honest with you. This is another unit that I'm not really sure. I can tell you right now that I'm debating between S and A, because dealing with blobs in much the same way as Rangers, they are pretty devastating. I can definitely say that. I think that on an open field they're going to be maybe a little bit more difficult to use. Rangers are a little bit more difficult to use on an open field as well, but at least they have a linear arc of fire, so they can actually hit units that are moving far away. Whereas the Iron Watch of Miramir kind of need a more static fight in order to be effective. But Khazad-dûm are pretty good at forcing those fights anyway, because they can definitely weather a storm, and eventually the enemy's going to have to engage with you. And when that time comes, you can go about your business with the Iron Watch potentially. And also one big advantage the Iron Watch have over Rangers is the fact that they're tanky. Multiple HP, heavy armour, going to be difficult to skirmish with. Obviously stuff like crossbows can do it. Armour-piercing archers can do it. But with Rangers, really any old archer can start to do the business. I think based on the devastation that I've seen the Iron Watch do, like specialist projectile units like this are kind of a difficult one to judge. I think I would say the Black Watch would be S tier when we get to Erebor. The Witchers would be very debatable because they're a little bit less potent than they used to be, and they're still just as vulnerable to range, but they're still so devastating to front lines. Oh, it's a difficult one. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and put them into S, I think. No other faction has really got access to a unit like the Iron Watch, and I think based on the way that Khazad-dûm play, more often than not, you're going to be able to use them to pretty decent effect. You know, and while they do have counters, any unit is going to have decent counters. Like the First Legion are very effective, but they're still going to be countered by sort of saturating them with ranged fire or even pushing them in from the sides of the formation. So I think I do have to give the Iron Watch of Mirror the benefit of the doubt here and put them into S. That might be a little generous. I think maybe, you know, it's definitely between S and A. It's definitely debatable, but regardless. Mercenary cavalry. So obviously cavalry is not what Khazad-dûm is known for. They have a very limited selection of cavalry, but what is here does have its uses. Starting off with the basic mercenary cavalry, very basic melee cavalry, pretty much the quintessential basic melee cavalry. Entirely going to be used defensively, really. They're going to be used to stop enemy cavalry from getting to your back ranks easily. Enemy cavalry is going to have to go through potentially mercenary cav, ranged fire from various sources, and of course your spears and pikes. Khazad-dûm, while they don't have a great deal of mobility themselves, the mercenary cavalry gives them enough to make it very awkward to defeat Khazad-dûm by just cycle charging them to death. And if used correctly, they could be very good at that. But don't expect the world of them. Like, they really are just an accompaniment to the other anti-cavalry tools you have at your disposal, be that sort of your spears or even axe throwers when you get close enough. I think you have to give them B because they do the job that Khazad-dûm needs them to do well enough. You can't expect too much of them, but I do think B is probably fair for them, just because Khazad-dûm have no other options in this regard. And it is necessary. On more open maps, you do need a little bit more mobility. Otherwise, you could find yourself getting pulled in every direction, and having a little bit of mobility of your own at least keeps the enemies on their toes. And if they commit too early, then your spears and your mercenary cavalry together can definitely pile on them and punish them for that. And then the mounted crossbowmen, the mercenary mounted crossbowmen. Another strange kind of unit, really, because they're a very specialised piece of equipment, really. They have very limited range, and they have very limited survivability against ranged fire themselves. So enemy archers, enemy horse archers, enemy crossbowmen as well, most of these tools are going to be able to very easily zone out the mercenary crossbowmen. The main thing they can do, of course, is kite enemy cavalry around and shoot them at close range, and their crossbow bolts are vicious, actually. They do a lot of good damage. And considering that, obviously, considering, you know, they don't have access to foot crossbows, you could just use them as regular crossbows if you want. There goes the dog again. But they are more exposed, the mercenary crossbowmen. I think, you know, that's one thing you do have to bear in mind. Like most other crossbows, one of the most crossbows that I will rate highly, rightly or wrongly, whether I like the unit or not, stuff like the Ironfoot crossbows and the Minhiriath sharpshooters, they're good because not only are they savage, but also they're pretty good at taking punishment themselves. It's not something you can say about the mercenary crossmen. There's less of them in the unit because they're cavalry. They're more exposed because they're on horseback and clearly visible. They are very damaging. I think C. I think they're just an average unit because you have to put in a lot of work on your part to make them perform to their potential, which when they do is great. You know, when they do, it can be a great accompaniment. And having one unit of them ride with some mercenary cavalry is not the worst thing you can do, because it gives Khazad-dûm a cav force of the size that you need to pay attention to if you're facing off against it. But I do think C is probably about right for them. The first unit that I would only rate as average in the Khazad-dûm roster. And that's Khazad-dûm. I mean, I think it's not too surprising to see that more of their units are at the higher end, because they have such a wide array of really good infantry units. And what support units they have as well are actually pretty decent as well. There's not many units in the Khazad-dûm roster that I would say are not really worth your time. Like D, Like, you can sometimes even sort of make the case for these 2 units down here in D tier. But up here, I mean, it's hard to go wrong with Khazad-dûm, to be honest with you. You know what the dwarves are going to be all about. You know how to build your army. Even someone completely new to the game would probably be able to see that. And that's one of the reasons why I rate Khazad-dûm to be quite strong in this new patch, to be honest with you. Especially in a siege, of course. Sieges have always been the natural terrain of the dwarves. But even on a more open field, I mean, Khazad-dûm, you kind of do have to play them in the same way that you would play a faction like Gondor, for example. Be a little bit more conservative, a little bit more on the back foot perhaps, and just make sure that everything is solid and organised, which can be a little bit drawn out and you maybe sort of sat there getting a bit impatient. But I actually think Khazad-dûm are maybe better than that even than Gondor. Like, Khazad-dûm, when they move forward, they have a little bit more oomph behind them because of their armour piercing across a lot of their heavier shock infantry units. But Khazad-dûm are also capable of taking such a beating as well. The only downside to that, of course, is you have, relatively speaking, smaller armies. So there is a bit of margin for error there. Obviously, if you do lose too many models early on, in much the same way as the elves, you could find yourselves facing a deficit that you can't really bring back. And that's obviously a balancing act you have to face off against. If you're up against someone like the Misty Mountains, for example, you know that you're probably going to be going up against a lot of numbers, and you may want to compensate by having some warriors of Khazad-dûm, as well as some 3rd Legion, for example, when you're talking about line infantry. But yeah, that was Khazad-dûm, obviously with the fixed Iron Watch of Miramir and the buffed 1st Legion pikes with their armour piercing. Those are 2 units which certainly wouldn't have been in S tier previously. The Iron Watch would have been down all the way in F, to be honest with you, in the last patch because they were broken. So yeah, Khazad-dûm are definitely a faction which the more recent patch has definitely benefited, I would suggest. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.